All right, so let's dive into this episode about one-night stands in college, the pros and cons.
Yeah, seems like a pretty interesting topic.
It is. I mean, college is this crazy time, right? Lots of new people, newfound freedom.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like a whole new world of social dynamics and experiences.
Exactly. And within that world, you have this phenomenon of the one-night stand.
Yeah, it's kind of like a rite of passage for some.
Right. So we're going to take a deep dive into this episode and see what insights we can glean.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so first off, how did the podcast hosts even define one-night stands? Did they have like a specific definition?
Well, they didn't explicitly give a formal definition, but they kind of framed it within the context of college.
Okay, that makes sense.
They were looking at it less as a universal thing and more as something specific to that college experience.
Gotcha. So what were some of the unique aspects of college that they highlighted?
Well, they talked a lot about the party culture,
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
for sure. And also just the general social dynamics of college.
Like everyone's kind of figuring themselves out, right?
Exactly. Lots of experimentation going on.
Plus, you're away from home maybe for the first time, so there's that sense of freedom.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit of invincibility, too.
They even shared a story from a student who described feeling like she was just playing a role in the whole hookup scene.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Like going through the motions because it felt like what everyone else was doing.
It really highlights how much our behavior can be influenced by social pressures, especially in a setting like college.
Totally. And it makes you wonder how much of it is genuine exploration versus just feeling like you should be having these experiences.
Right, like, is it really what you want, or are you just trying to fit in?
Exactly. And that kind of leads into what the podcast highlighted as some of the potential benefits of one-night stands.
Like what?
Well, they talked about how these encounters can be a form of personal growth and self-discovery.
Oh, yeah, especially during a time when you're figuring out who you are and what you like.
Right. And they use this really interesting analogy.
What was it?
They compare it to a buffet.
A buffet?
Yeah, you can sample different dishes without committing to a whole meal.
Okay, I see where they're going with that.
It's about trying things out, seeing what resonates with you, and understanding that not every encounter has to lead to something more.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes the element of choice.
Exactly. It's about making conscious decisions rather than feeling pressured or obligated.
And they also talked about how one-night stands can be a way to meet new people and experience intimacy, like without the demands of a traditional relationship.
Right. And they even shared some listener stories where individuals expressed feeling empowered by choosing to engage in casual sex on their own terms.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. It kind of challenges the traditional negative narratives around one-night stands, especially for women.
Definitely. It suggests that these encounters can actually be a source of empowerment and agency, especially when approached with clear intentions and communication.
They even brought in a psychologist who talked about how one-night stands can be a way of asserting control over your sexuality and breaking free from societal expectations.
That's really powerful, especially in a society that often tries to dictate how people, especially women, should express their sexuality.
But of course, the podcast didn't just focus on the positive side.
Right. They also dove into the potential downsides, like the emotional complexities that can arise.
Yeah, they shared some pretty raw listener stories about people who ended up feeling confused, hurt, or even regretful after a hookup.
It just goes to show that even without the intention of commitment, emotions can still get involved.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And they even brought up the concept of cognitive dissonance.
What's that?
Well, it's this mental discomfort that happens when our actions and beliefs clash.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, if you believe casual sex is wrong, but you engage in it anyway, you might experience this inner conflict that leads to guilt or shame.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's not just about the act itself, but the potential internal struggle it can create.
Exactly. And they even mentioned a study that linked casual sex with increased anxiety and depression in some individuals.
So it's a reminder that these encounters aren't always as carefree as they might seem.
For sure. There are real mental health implications to consider.
And they didn't stop there. They also talked about the very real risks of STIs and unwanted pregnancy.
Yeah, that's a big one. They really emphasize the importance of open communication about sexual history and safe sex practices.
And they had a story from a listener who contracted an STI after a one-night stand because their partner wasn't honest about their status.
It's a stark reminder that protecting your health is crucial, even in casual encounters.
And they also touched on the social and reputational risks that can sometimes come with hookup culture.
Like how gossip can spread quickly in a college environment.
Right. They shared an anecdote from a student who felt ostracized by her peer group after rumors about her hookup started circulating.
Yeah, it shows how social pressures can influence not only the decision to engage in casual sex, but also the potential fallout.
So it seems like the podcast is really trying to present a balanced perspective on this complex issue.
Definitely. They're not saying it's all good or all bad, but encouraging listeners to think critically about their own values, desires, and boundaries.
Exactly. And I think that's a great message for our listeners as well.
It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to one-night stands.
It's a personal decision with potential consequences that need to be carefully considered.
And that brings us to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll unpack some of those considerations and help our listener navigate this complex terrain. So we were talking about how the college environment adds this whole other level of complexity to one-night stands.
Yeah, for sure. It's like this mix of excitement and new experiences.
Totally. But the podcast really digs into the potential downsides, especially the emotional stuff.
Right, like even if you go into a hookup thinking it's just physical, feelings can still get involved.
Exactly. And they had this great term for it, emotional hangover.
Emotional hangover. I like that.
Yeah, it's like the morning after the party, all the excitement's gone, and you're left with these icky feelings.
Okay, I get it. So how did the podcast connect that to one-night stands?
Well, they talked about how sometimes you can feel regret or confusion after a hookup,
Right, makes sense.
and they brought up this idea of attachment style.
Attachment styles. Okay, I'm not really familiar with that.
So it's basically a way of understanding how people form bonds in relationships.
Oh, interesting.
It's based on your childhood experiences,
Right, okay.
and it kind of shapes how you approach intimacy and how you deal with rejection.
So are they saying that people with different attachment styles might react differently to one-night stands?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like someone who's really anxious about closeness might feel way more insecure after a casual hookup,
Oh, that makes sense.
and someone who avoids intimacy might just shut down emotionally.
Wow, so these patterns can actually play a big role.
Yeah, and the podcast even suggested that having a lot of one-night stands might reinforce those patterns.
Huh, so if you keep avoiding intimacy, it's like you're just digging yourself deeper into that hole.
Right. And that's where self-awareness comes in.
Yeah, that was a big theme in the podcast, right?
Huge. It's all about knowing yourself, your emotional needs, and what you really want out of these experiences.
So it's not just about protecting yourself physically, but emotionally too.
Exactly. Because even a casual hookup can have a big impact on your well-being.
And they had that therapist on the show who talked about how even a brief encounter can bring up past emotional wounds.
Yeah, if you've been hurt before, a one-night stand might trigger those feelings without you even realizing it.
So it's really important to be in a good headspace before even considering a hookup.
Definitely. And the podcast also stressed the importance of setting boundaries.
Like what kind of boundaries?
Well, it could be anything from being upfront about your expectations to defining what behaviors are okay and not okay with you.
I imagine those conversations can be awkward, though.
For sure. But the podcast argued that it's worth it to prevent misunderstandings or hurt feelings.
It's about prioritizing respect and communication, even in a casual setting.
Exactly. Which leads to another crucial point. Consent.
Oh, yeah, they really emphasized that, didn't they?
Yeah, they made it clear that consent isn't just a one-time thing.
It's a continuous process throughout the whole encounter.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And they even shared a story about a listener who changed her mind during a hookup.
Yeah, and the guy, even though he was initially hesitant, ended up respecting her decision.
It's a great example of how consent can be withdrawn at any time.
And it ties back to that idea of agency and empowerment.
Totally. It's about taking ownership of your choices and advocating for your needs.
And the podcast didn't shy away from the health and safety aspects either.
Right. They talked about the risks of STIs and unplanned pregnancies.
And how important it is to use protection and to be open about your sexual history.
They even shared a story about a student who was super anxious after a hookup because she wasn't sure if they had used protection properly.
That must have been scary.
Yeah, it just shows that the emotional impact of a one-night stand can last a lot longer than the actual encounter.
So knowledge is power in these situations.
For sure. And the podcast highlighted the need for good sex education so people can make informed decisions.
So how do you think all of this connects with our listener? You know, someone who's trying to figure out their own stance on one-night stands.
Well, I think the podcast gives them a really good framework for understanding the complexity of it all.
Okay, so it's not about telling people what to do, but helping them figure out what's right for them.
Exactly. And it reminds them that one-night stands can have both positive and negative aspects.
And that it's super important to be self-aware, communicate openly, and prioritize both physical and emotional well-being.
Absolutely. It's about making choices that align with your own values and taking care of yourself in the process. So we spent a lot of time talking about one-night stands in college.
Yeah, it's like its own unique world down there.
Totally.
Yeah.
But the podcast kind of hinted at this bigger question. What about one-night stands after college?
Yeah. Like, do things change as we get older?
That's what I was wondering too. Like, imagine someone in their late 20s or 30s, maybe they've even been married.
Right. Do one-night stands mean something different to them?
Well, the podcast mentioned this idea of sexual scripts changing over time.
Remind me again what those are?
It's basically society's expectations about how we're supposed to behave sexually.
Oh, right. Right.
And in college, the script is all about hooking up and experimenting.
But maybe as we get older, our priorities shift.
Exactly. Like, casual sex might not be as appealing anymore.
Or maybe it takes on a whole new meaning.
Yeah, because we've learned more about ourselves and what we really want.
I guess our definition of what's meaningful changes too.
For sure. And the podcast even suggested that as we age, we might look for more than just physical attraction.
Yeah, like maybe we want a connection, even if it's just for one night.
Right. And that's where self-awareness and communication become even more important.
Because we're bringing more baggage to the table.
It's exactly.
Past relationships, emotional wounds, maybe even kids.
So it's not just about protecting yourself physically, but emotionally too.
Absolutely. You have to know your boundaries and what you're comfortable with.
And be upfront with your partner about your needs.
Yeah, because these encounters can have ripple effects on other parts of our lives.
The podcast actually brought up the concept of ethical non-monogamy.
Oh, yeah, where people have multiple relationships, including casual ones, but it's all consensual and transparent.
So it challenges the idea that one-night stands have to be secretive or deceptive.
Right. It shows that they can be a part of someone's life in an ethical and responsible way.
As long as everyone involved is on the same page.
Exactly. And it highlights how important communication is, not just for the people hooking up, but for their other relationships too.
Like their friends, family, or even other partners.
It's all connected.
So it sounds like the podcast is asking us to think about how those societal judgments around casual sex change as we get older. Do they disappear? Do they become less harsh? Or do they just morph into something else?
It's a good question because, let's face it, society can be pretty judgmental, especially towards women who have casual sex.
Yeah, it's like this double standard.
Exactly. On one hand, we're supposed to be sexually liberated, but on the other hand, we're still judged for it.
It's definitely a mixed message.
So as our listeners think about their own choices, they have to ask themselves, how much are they influenced by those outside pressures?
Versus what they truly want and need.
That's a powerful question, and I think it's a great takeaway from this whole deep dive.
It's not about telling people what's right or wrong.
It's about giving them the information and the different perspectives so they can make their own informed decisions.
And hopefully feel more empowered in the process.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground today.
We did. From the college hookup scene to the psychology of casual sex, and even how those dynamics might change as we get older.
It's a complex topic with no easy answers. But hopefully our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of themselves and the choices they make.
And maybe even a few things to think about for the future.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
And until next time, be good to yourselves and to each other.